Hi everyone, Stepan here. It's Friday, so welcome to another Friday Middlegame video. Today's topic is unlike the other ones. I didn't choose a pattern in the Middlegame. I chose something that I find really important and that I've been trying to improve at for 2 years now, actually. And I created a technique to do it. It's not perfect, but it works for me. And I think I've managed to improve on my mistakes significantly since I started using this. Now, we're going to be looking at how to detect and improve on your middle game mistakes. Of course, that's much harder than working on your openings or on your end games because there is no reference most of the time. So basically, when you mess up in the opening or when you turn on the engine and the engine says this was a bad move, you can get an openings book and you can turn on the live book on Lichess or on ChessBase or on chess.com, doesn't matter, and you can find out what the correct move is. Now, if you know what the correct move is, it's not that hard to deduce why it's a good move. Okay, you can also improve on your openings by going through Grandmaster games in the same variations. For endgames as well, I mean, you can take Dvoretsky's endgame manual, find the chapter on the endgame that you lost, and find the technique, find the rules, and improve on your play. For middle games, it's much harder, and the reason why I think it's much harder is because it's not easy to detect your mistakes because there are no references. Now, in my imaginary world, the engines don't exist. Therefore, you don't just turn on the engine and the engine says, well, this was a mistake, you should have played this, because in my opinion, that's pointless. And compared to you finding out where your mistakes were, that's almost insignificant. Okay, so I've created a technique with which I deduce where my mistakes were and then improve on them. And I can say that my success rate for finding bad moves has increased significantly. And when I analyze my game properly and use this, I rarely miss a mistake. Okay, so to illustrate this, I'm going to use one of my own games. And specifically, I'm going to use one of my own games, which was extremely hard to analyze when I first looked at it. This game I played in the Croatian Cup last May. During the cup, I played 3 games, had 2 wins, 1 defeat. This was in round 1. I was playing board 4 for my team. You can find this game on ChessDB, on Chess Tempo, and it's almost everywhere online. I was playing Josip Krklec. I had white pieces. My opponent was rated just above 2000 ELO, so about 100 points higher rated than me, 150. Okay, before I get to the checklist, I'm just going to show you the position which we are going to be looking at. So we had e4, he played the Sicilian, I played the closed Sicilian, and g6, which is slightly weird, not the most common move, but anyway, that's not the point. Bishop g7, knight f3, I'm playing the Grand Prix setup, knight c6, bishop b5, this is very normal, d6. Castles, bishop d7, d3, e6. Now, e6 I knew was slightly uncommon, but again, let's not dwell on the opening too much. From here on, I'm starting the middle game analysis, because from here on I was out of my opening book. So the question about when does the middle game begin, since there is no clear answer and most people will say once the pieces are developed, etc., etc., I think a good rule to follow is the middle game begins once you are out of book. And from there on, try to treat it like a middle game. That's not a good rule, but it has helped me because that's basically the point where I start thinking. So for me, the middle game starts when I have to start thinking about my own moves. So here, in this starting position, I've started my analysis the first time I did this. And my analysis was unsuccessful. And I'm going to show you why in a minute. When I did the second run over this game, when I was trying to decide whether I want to focus on the open Sicilian or on the closed Sicilian, I actually used my checklist and I managed to improve on my play significantly, especially for this game. Now, once again, I didn't use the engine when I did the run through this game. I only used it to check my analysis. That's what I would like to induce you to do. Go over what this checklist and what I'm talking about first yourself, because that's the best way to understand where your mistakes are and to understand what you don't understand. Because then later on, when you turn on the engine, the engine is going to point out the mistakes that you missed, and that's actually very instructive. Then you can start over and ask yourself, well, why didn't I think about this? Why didn't I think about that? Okay, so anyway, what I do in positions like these, which I don't understand, which I lost, I try to figure out where my first mistake was. So the first rule 0 is find out exactly when your position became unpleasant. That means at which point did you either start thinking, well, my position is bad, my position is worse than his, my position is worse than it used to be. And for me, it was, well, actually 2 moves later. So here I played bishop d2, he played knight g2 e7, and I played rook to b1. Rook to b1 was already a move which I played because I thought my position was unpleasant. Okay, so when I was analyzing this, I came to this position and said, okay, knight g2 e7, I had to play rook to b1, or I thought I had to play rook to b1. I was afraid of course, I wanted to move my knight, I wanted to reinforce the d4 square. I didn't want to lose the b-pawn. I was also afraid of moves like queen b6, in which case probably bishop takes, and I would have to go bishop c6, and I saw a lot of tricks. So I played rook b1 prophylactically. Okay, so I started here. Now, to go over the checklist, this is the first thing you need to figure out. Now, it of course helps if the game is fresh. For me, I did this 6 months after the game, so it wasn't fresh at all, but you can recall your memories. So yeah, I knew that rook to b1 was already a concession in my mind, because, and I remember vividly talking to Mate, who was there with me after the game. He said, you played rook b1, why do you play rook b1? And I explained, like, I didn't know what to do, I wanted to defend against all of these threats. And since that move seemed counterintuitive to him, I knew that it was a concession, and I knew that later on my doubts were correct. Okay, so here we start. So what I have to do now is go over the checklist you can see it on the screen and also in the description. And you need to figure out where your mistake was and which one of these was it, okay, and what happened. Okay, so first thing is check your prophylactic moves. There weren't any so far. Rook b1 is the first one. I don't think rook b1 in itself is a mistake. Check your attacking moves, no attacking moves. Check all your pawn moves. These pawn moves are theoretical. Captures, no captures really. Check every retreat, no retreats really. A bad piece, well, yes, I do see a bad piece. And in my analysis, when I was trying to figure out where my mistake was, I looked at the bishop on d2, and the first thing is I couldn't figure out what the advantage of the bishop on d2 is compared to c1. Okay, so that was the first question mark. And then I thought to myself, well, what if the bishop was still on c1? Okay, so what would be better? If the bishop was still on c1, of course, in this position, I could go knight to e2 without losing the b-pawn, for one. The second thing is, which now I'm going to move on to the sort of complicated part of this analysis and how I found that this indeed was the mistake. I used reference games to see whether the bishop is actually used on d2 or not. Okay, so if you have doubts that one of your moves is a mistake, if it's a move very early on in the game, you can still use reference games. Since your opening decisions influence the middle game, sometimes your middle game decisions will have been caused by a mistake you did in the opening. Therefore, you first need to correct your opening mistakes. Okay, so when I was looking at reference games, and I'm going to show you a few which I used. You can find them, by the way, on chessgames.com. You can find them on Lichess. Just get to the position that you're wondering about and see whether there are any reference games. Just press on the book thing on Lichess. So I used several games from similar positions to see what had actually happened. Okay. So first of all, we go back to the original position after bishop to e6. So if I had doubts that bishop d2 was a bad move, well, then I have to figure out what strong players do. When you turn on this book thing on Lichess or anywhere on ChessBase, I quickly saw that bishop d2 has never been played. Now, one move that stood out, or two moves that stood out, were bishop takes c6 and f5. Okay, and then I had to figure out what was wrong with my move and what would have been better with these two moves. Well, firstly, bishop takes c6 has been played 20 times. Of course, once I allow knight to e7, then he can recapture with the knight. And one of the main ideas of the Grand Prix is to get rid of your bishop, get your pawns on light squares, and well, basically play without the bishop. So bishop to d2 is wrong for two reasons. Firstly, it puts my bishop on a bad square. For three reasons. It undefends my b2 pawn and it doesn't capture the knight. Okay, so the alternative to bishop c6 was f5, which is obviously an attacking move, and that's a pattern I know, which I tried to make work during the game. Okay, so now I know that bishop d2 has never been played. When I looked at the reference games, and the reference games were, in my case, Emil Sutovsky, Kempinski, Nuri, Li Chao, I looked at about 10 reference games just to figure out what people do with that bishop. I quickly realized that everybody leaves the bishop on c1, or they develop it to g5. Only very rarely does the bishop go to e3. And then I figured out that, okay, my bishop is not good on d2 because it undefends the pawn, because it blocks my queen, because it doesn't guard the d4 square, because it basically does nothing, doesn't improve my position. The only reason why bishop d2 could be a good move is if bishop takes c3 is played, but that's never going to happen. So, okay, this was important because my mistakes later on in the game were basically caused by this move. And I think this was the start of my problems. Okay, now what I should have done in this position was simply bishop takes c6, and after bishop takes c6, f5, and I have a very strong Grand Prix attacking position where his king is still in the center and absolutely no problems. But bishop d2, seemingly a normal move, but the start of serious issues. Knight g2 e7. Now, of course, bishop c6 doesn't work as well because he takes with the knight. He has huge control over d4. He can castle if I do something aggressive. And now, yeah, in this position, my first really middle game mistake, or my first weird middle game move, rook to b1. When I was analyzing this move, I just couldn't find a good alternative. What do I do? Now, f5 is protected too many times. I don't have a clear way to continue. I could play the move queen to e1, continuing my attack, but then I was really worried about queen b6. And in this position, well, what do? He is now threatening bishop takes c3, and I mean, well, okay, he's not threatening bishop takes c3. Okay, I was afraid of queen b6. For now, he's not threatening bishop takes c3 because the rook is hanging, but he could castle and then threaten bishop takes c3. So I was afraid of things like this. Of course, sometimes, and this is the first thing on the list, sometimes we are afraid of things that don't exist. So now when I look at rook to b1, and I think, okay, defended everything perfectly, that's the first thing on my checklist because that's my most common mistake. I defend against something that doesn't exist. So check your prophylactic moves. When you go through your game, when you see a move which you played specifically to defend against something, you need to figure out whether there was a more active alternative, because sometimes or always an unnecessary defense is a waste of time which you could have spent doing something much better. But yeah, in my analysis after that, I figured that rook to b1 was a good move, because if I don't play rook to b1, as I said, if I continue like this, he could probably castle and then start putting pressure on my position with knight to d4, queen to b6, and he basically has no issues. My knight is still tied down. I don't really have an attack yet, so yeah, okay. So rook to b1. He castled. Okay, and here I'm just going to go through the moves which I think were good, or which I thought were good. Knight e2, that was the point of rook b1. I want to increase control over d4. I want to get my knight to the king side. I want to control some more squares. I want to play f5, basically attack. Here he played e5, which confused me. I took it. I think taking was a good move. Maybe bishop c4 could have been played. And of course he cannot take, he takes f4, because now I just have a very pleasant position, my b2 pawn is defended. But after bishop c4 he could probably keep the tension in the position, maybe play king h8, f5. Of course bishop c4 should be a good move, because it improves one of my bad pieces. But after e5 I thought if I take, then I should hold a slight edge because I trade pieces off. Now, In this position, he played knight takes e5, which, in my opinion, in my analysis, was a mistake for him. And here was my second mistake. In this position, I played bishop takes d7. Now, on the checklist here, you can see check every capture. So here, of course, I checked both f takes e and now bishop takes d7. What happened in the game after bishop takes d7, queen takes d7, knight takes e5, d takes e5, is that all of a sudden I had this weakness on d3 which I couldn't easily get rid of with c4 because it's hanging, as you're going to see, and he can start undermining my position. Not that his position is really good because his bishop is bad, but I still thought bishop takes d7 was a mistake. So when I checked the capture, the first thing you do when you see a capture and try to figure out whether it was good or not, you look for alternatives. Obviously my bishop is hanging, so I have to do something forcing. The only two alternatives I see, the only real alternative I see is knight takes knight, because if I play bishop c4 then knight c4, if I play bishop a4 then bishop takes bishop. So it wasn't hard to analyze the other variation. After knight takes e5, he has two moves. He can play bishop b5 or bishop e5. Bishop e5 was quite easy to analyze. If bishop takes e5, then bishop takes d7, queen takes d7 is forced, and now bishop h6 would leave me with a much better pawn structure after bishop g7, king g7. He has a weakness I don't, and I could play c4. So for example, so here, c4, knight c3, knight d5, a very pleasant position where if his knight moves, I can jump into d5. If it doesn't, he has a permanent weakness on d6, which isn't easy to target, but it's not easy to get rid of. Any endgame should be better for me. After knight e5, the second option was, of course, bishop takes b5, which is slightly more complicated, and which is the reason why I took on d7, and this is something I couldn't calculate during the game. Because I couldn't see a very active continuation. The continuation is knight g4, and of course f5 begs to be played. If f5 isn't played, then I have this and huge control over d5. So f5, now I don't really have time to read out my knight because f4 and stuff like that could come. So my analysis was knight h6, king h8, ef5, knight f5, rook f5, and after rook f5, gf5, of course, I have a very pleasant position. So this was, I don't want to take too long on this, but this was my analysis post-mortem. So I concluded that in this position, bishop takes d7 is a mistake, because when I take the knight, whatever he does, I have a much better position. So whenever you've captured the piece, whenever you have a move that's a capture, analyze it. Also, always analyze your retreats. Okay, so bishop takes d7. Queen takes d7. Now, of course, I captured knight takes e5 in the game because I thought that bishop takes would lead to bishop c3, which would be much more pleasant for me with this pawn as a weakness. And after what happened in the game, d takes e5, I did it because of a very specific reason. Now, whether knight takes e5 was a mistake, I couldn't decide. And it's very important to see the rest of the game to see why. Okay, now we come to my next mistake, bishop e3. And again, it's very hard to see why this is a mistake. So, coming all the way back to bishop d2 in the opening, if my bishop was still on c1, then I wouldn't have wasted time on rook b1, etc., so it would have been simple. The problem with my bishop on d2 in this position is that I want to play something that seems very strong, but I can't because my d3 pawn is hanging. The whole idea behind the move knight takes e5 was that after he takes with the pawn, eventually I will play c4, knight c3, knight d5, and once he takes, because he would have to take, I would recapture with the pawn and have a passed pawn on d5. A big strategic advantage. So, that's why I took on e5. After d takes e5, finding out whether knight e5 was a mistake is connected to many things. So I played bishop e3. Obviously, I played bishop e3 to be able to play c4, knight c3, and here. In the game, he continued rook a to c8, which I think was not the most precise move, but I couldn't figure out what else to do. Maybe b6 is better. I don't know. But yeah, here I played my next mistake, which we're going to talk about in a second. But let's find out why I thought bishop e3 was a mistake. So my goal was clear. I'm moving the same piece twice and not improving it significantly, because of course he could play b6 or rook c8. And he wants to play rook c8 anyway, because he wants to push c4. If he pushes c4, I don't play c4, my pawn structure is ruined. So bishop e3 helped him do what he wanted to do, which is to play c4, which makes it very hard for me to continue playing. Okay, when I was analyzing this position and looking for alternatives, I found the move bishop to g5, which I thought was extremely strong. And bishop g5, there are two options for him: either save the knight or chase the bishop away. That's basically it. If he does something like, I don't know, rook to d8, let's say rook f to d8, no, rook a to d8. Okay, then I would take the knight. Queen takes c7 and knight to c3. And now, strategically, of course, this is good knight versus bad bishop. f5 doesn't help much because knight d5, if he takes, I take. And this position, I think, is strategically winning. So in my analysis, I concluded that this is winning. Okay, so after bishop e3, I found, I'm sorry, instead of bishop e3, I found bishop g5 as a move that does more, but serves the same purpose. And my analysis was, if he goes knight c6, well, then he's not controlling d5 anymore, so I don't even have to play c4, so I can just continue knight c3. If he goes back, I take it. If he plays knight b4, I play a3, chase it away. So knight c6 I didn't think was a viable option. And finally, after bishop g5, f6, bishop h4, I now provoked a concession, which, of course, playing f6 weakens your back rank, makes your position much harder to play. My bishop is going to be rerouted to the f2 square, which is really good, making it harder for him to play c4, controlling the d4 square. Still, I can, if he goes rook c8, I can go c4, knight c3, knight d5. So I'm accomplishing everything I wanted to accomplish with bishop e3, but I also do much more, and whatever he does, I provoke a weakness. So bishop e3, definitely a mistake. I found an improvement. Whenever you find a mistake, try to find a move that does what you wanted to do, if what you wanted to do is the correct idea, and then try to find a move that does more than that. Okay, so he played rook a to c8, and here was one of my worst mistakes. Okay, so in this position I played b3. b3 doesn't do anything. It stops c4 by brute force, but it wastes precious time. So b3 was probably my worst move in the middle game after the bishop d2 blunder in the opening. So b3 is just a bad move. Of course, if I don't do anything, if I, let's say, play king h1, then c4, and I think black is so much better than that white will have a very hard time fighting in this position. I think this is just overwhelmingly good for black. So that had to be stopped. But again, look at your prophylactic moves. Again, for me, those are my most common mistakes. Very often my prophylactic moves are the moves that are bad. Of course, for you, it could be anything else on this checklist. For me, it's just most often prophylaxis. Okay, so what I should have done, which I found out in a second when I was looking at this position. Actually, I saw this move when I was looking at it for the first time as well. So what I thought to myself, okay, idiot, you played bishop e3 to play c4, knight c3. Why not play c4? And I just couldn't see what the problem was. In the game, I was very afraid of f5, but f5 just doesn't work. The reason why I didn't play c4 during the game, and I saw it as an option, was that I didn't even bother to calculate f5. I just looked at c4, f5, no, that doesn't work. When I came home, when I started analyzing this position, I saw that f5 can simply be met with knight c3. Of course, if he takes, that's no problem. I take with the pawn, play knight d5. If he pushes, again, no problem. He doesn't have anything. My knight is jumping into d5. I'm going to have a passed pawn. I'm controlling the d4 square. My bishop is way better than his, even if it gets traded off. But if it gets traded off for the knight, for example, knight c6, knight d5, knight d4, takes, then this is good knight versus bad bishop. Pawn majority on the queen side, position is winning. So b3 was a huge mistake. The reason why I found b3 was that in my second run over this game, was I tried to focus on my most common mistakes. I tried to focus on my prophylactic moves. Again, for you, it could be anything from this checklist, but from my experience and statistically for me, When I check everything on this checklist, I find 90% of my mistakes, which is incredible, and which I think is the hardest part of improving your middle game play. Okay, let's continue. We will be done very shortly. So b3, f5. Here was my, well, second biggest mistake, probably way more significant than b3, but yeah, still. In this position I took on f5, which he didn't use, and I had to do my own analysis to figure out how he could have used it. Of course, in the King's Indian, in the Rossolimo, in many of these positions where black plays f5, once you take it, he recaptures with the g-pawn. And that was just the way to punish my mistake here. Just g takes and he would have been much better. After ef, he continued knight takes, which was no problem, but we are going to see. Okay, so f5 was a huge mistake because it allowed, I'm sorry, e takes f5 was a huge mistake because it allowed him to activate his bishop, to all of a sudden control all of these squares, to get his knight active, let's say knight g6, f4, to threaten my pieces, to open up my king, to play king h8, rook g8, just crushing me. So after f5, what do? When I was trying to figure out what a good alternative was, I again came up with the move c4. I mean, c4, if he takes, I again take with the pawn and go for knight c3, so I could have just kept the tension in the position. This was... And again, I was afraid of him advancing, which I shouldn't have been. I mean, there are no problems in this position. My bishop is just much better than his. b3 included is just a bad idea. Of course, I wasted the tempo, but this still would have been better. So as I said, after ef5, he didn't take the opportunity to get a winning position with gf. He played knight f. And now, of course, the next few moves are logical. Bishop f2, bishop h6. Knight g3, I checked and I checked and I checked. Of course, this is the point in the checklist where you have to investigate every point in which you initiated an exchange. Here, of course, he is not really threatening knight to e3 because I would take it. I doubt that his bishop is such a good piece. So I wanted to trade off the minor pieces to be able to exploit his weaknesses. That was my reasoning. And of course, if I do something else with my knight, then he jumps into d4 or e3 and puts pressure on my position. He had much more active pieces, much more space, more weaknesses, so my conclusion was that knight g3 was a good move. Now, whether he should have played knight e3 or not, I don't think he should have played it, because if here, bishop takes king h1, I will permanently have the e4 square, therefore that idea doesn't work. And this, I think, would be strategically very good for white. Maybe not enough to win, maybe enough to win. My conclusion was that I could probably squeeze something out of this position because my knight is much better than his bishop. But then again, it would be easy to make a mistake because my dark squares are horrible and he could attack me. But after knight g3 he took, bishop takes g3 of course, queen d4, king h1, everything normal, and here bishop f4. And here was my next mistake. Okay, so once again, whenever a trade is offered, check that too, not just your trades. So here a trade was offered. I can either retreat, defend, ignore, counterattack. In the game, I took bishop takes f4, which is a dreadful decision. When I checked the capture, bishop takes f4, I immediately thought to myself, well, why would I allow the rook to f4? That makes absolutely no sense. This is what happened in the game. So it didn't take me long to find a good alternative. I actually found two good alternatives. One is bishop f2. And after queen d5, queen to e2, keeping a lot of control in the position, controlling this dark square diagonal, also improving my queen, maybe in some positions playing queen e4 after rook to e1. And basically, I mean, no problems here. If I play bishop e3, I should be slightly better. So this, I think, was the best way to go. Also, a good move was queen g4, just activating my my queen. Now if bishop takes g3, I don't take the queen, improving his pawn structure. I play queen takes g3. The difference is, of course, his rook is not an f4. Why would I allow his rook to f4? Made no sense. In the game I took, he played rook takes. I, of course, took. Again, when I was trying to figure out whether this recapture was good, of course it's good, because if I don't take, then he plays rook f8 and I'm in a lot of trouble. So rook takes, queen takes, and now we could count this as the endgame, but this is the last move we are going to look at. I played a move which I I just don't understand how I could have played it. I played queen f3, which allows queen f3, gf3, giving him a better pawn structure. Instead of that, of course, the easy to find alternative is queen to f1. So this was my final middle game mistake. When I finished analyzing this game, I turned on the engine and I'd actually found all of my mistakes, which was astonishing. And when you look at it, starting here, e6, bishop to d2, first mistake, obviously, theory told me that. Okay, rook to b1 was actually a good move. And then after e5, f takes e5 was okay. After knight takes e5, bishop takes d7 was a mistake, knight takes e5 was better, but not a big mistake. After here, d takes e5 was correct for him. Bishop e3 again, a mistake. The engine for some reason wanted to play b4. Now that's a move I don't understand at all. I would never play b4 and then allow c4. It gives a slightly better position for black, but I don't want to do that. So when I checked my move, bishop g5, the engine was actually very happy with all of my variations. It all worked out. It wasn't the best move, but I think for humans this is much easier to play, so I'd actually found a much better plan. Okay, rook ac8, b3, of course, a dreadful move. Here, the engine also likes a4, which again, I don't understand, so I would never play it. It likes c4 a lot, so this was good. After f5, the engine hates e takes f5, I was correct, and of course it likes g takes. So I was actually able to find all of my mistakes, and believe it or not, it didn't take me more than 4 hours, which may seem like a lot, but if you are able to correct or to detect all of your mistakes from a tournament game in 4 hours without using the engine, I think that's very, very good. And I mean, it's a huge improvement for me. Previous to having trained that, it would take me much longer or I would miss a lot. Now, of course, I still miss 1 out of 10 mistakes, regardless of how much time I invest. But yeah, I find out where most of them are. Now, to part 2, correcting your mistakes. This is connected to opening play a lot. As you saw, bishop d2 was basically the start of my trouble. And what I do to correct my mistakes is I use reference games. As I said, I used reference games for this one, and I saw that bishop to d2 is never played. I saw that bishop takes c6 is played because you want him to take with that bishop, you want to be able to play f5. So your middle game plans and your middle game mistakes are going to depend a lot on you understanding your mistakes, or on you understanding the openings you play. Now, once you're out of the opening, once you, let's say, get here, so when I took on f5, the easy way to correct that mistake is, once you detect it, to analyze what would have happened in case you hadn't taken. In my case, I saw that the position was perfectly fine. I could have gone for the plan I wanted to go for, the reason why I played bishop e3, and everything would have worked in my favor. Since I took, the position got unbearable. Now, at that point, I wasn't really familiar with the King's Indian types of position. I didn't really know about f5 and stuff like that because I'd never played d4, and I actually had never studied the King's Indian. I only studied it and did videos on it a month after the tournament. So this plan was unfamiliar to me. As you go along, as you analyze, as you find alternatives for your mistakes, these patterns are going to get reinforced in your brain. So the way to correct your mistakes is to look for alternatives by yourself until you find something good. And as you go along, this is of course a very time-consuming process that takes years. I'm probably 1%. I've probably accomplished 1% of what I should in my middle game studies, but I think I've already improved significantly compared to last year. And yeah, once you find a mistake, spend as much time as you need. Sometimes I would spend days looking at the same position, trying to make something work before using an engine. And most of the time that would pay off. And the thing is, once you invest your brain and your time and you struggle to find something good, then you remember it. Okay, also, it's important to check rule 0 again. Go back to the first position when you started feeling unpleasant, where you thought your position was harder to play than his. That's very important. Analyzing e takes f5 here would be stupid because I hadn't figured out what led to that. Try to reconstruct the whole process. Find mistake 0, find patient 0. What led to your downfall? What was the first mistake? Finally, I had the position where I had an isolated pawn on f3, but it all started because of bishop d2. Okay, I hope this video makes sense. This is something I do with all of my games. I'm doing that with my training games as well. And I'm analyzing my training games this way. I'm actually making lists of my mistakes according to openings, and this has helped a lot. And once I do this for a game, I become much better at understanding the middle game from the variation that was played. Okay, thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you think. Join me on stream today at 8 p.m. Croatian if you have the time. We will play a rapid tournament, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.